Picture this. It's the winter of 1547 in Whitehall Palace. The great bed of state creaks under the weight of a man who once terrified Europe. The air in the chamber is thick with the sour mix of sweat, wine, and something else, something putrid that no amount of incense or rosewater can quite cover. On the bed lies Henry VIII, King of England, Lord of Ireland, self-styled defender of the faith and head of the church, now swollen, wheezing, and wrapped in bandages that must be changed constantly because the flesh on his legs won't stop leaking. Courtiers stand at a careful distance. Servants open a window just a crack to let in January air, then close it again before the king complains of the cold. Every movement hurts him. Sitting hurts. Standing is almost impossible without pulleys and attendants. The man who once dazzled ambassadors with his athleticism now needs a small team just to turn over. This is the king who, according to later observers, stank of corruption. Not because he was metaphorically rotten, though we can argue that too, but because parts of his body were literally breaking down while he was still alive. But how did Henry VIII, who started his reign as a golden Renaissance prince, end up as the king who seemed to rot alive? Let's rewind. If you met Henry in his 20s, you wouldn't recognize him from that grotesque throne room painting in your head. Early ambassadors describe a tall, broad-shouldered redhead, over 6 feet, muscular, with a 32 to 34-inch waist, who hunted all day, jousted in tournaments, danced at night, and played tennis in between. He composed music, spoke multiple languages, and loved showing off his calves in tight hose. This Henry is the one who married Catherine of Aragon, wrote learned attacks on Martin Luther, and presided over glittering courts that made foreign envoys a little bit jealous. The dark comedy is that Henry spends the first half of his life obsessed with health, beauty, and virility, and the second half trapped in a body that betrays all three. A big turning point comes in January 1536. Picture Greenwich Palace, the tilt-yard packed with spectators, trumpets blaring. Henry is 44, still addicted to jousting even though he's no longer in his physical prime. He goes into the lists in full armor. His horse stumbles. Henry crashes to the ground, and another horse reportedly falls on top of him. For 2 hours he lies unconscious. When they get him up, they realize something else, an old leg wound, likely a varicose vein or deep bruise from an earlier tournament, has burst open. From that moment on, his left leg in particular becomes a battlefield of its own. Early modern medicine has very few good tools for dealing with deep vein problems or chronic infection. Surgeons open and drain the wound, apply poultices, wrap it in bandages soaked with various herbal concoctions and animal fats. It heals. Sort of. Then it breaks down again. Over time, ulcers appear on both legs, oozing fluid and frequently becoming infected. They're painful, they smell, and they limit how much he can move. Imagine trying to rule a fractious kingdom while every step feels like fire. Because exercise now hurts, Henry moves less. Because he moves less, he gains weight. Because he gains weight, his circulation gets worse, which makes the ulcers even harder to heal. It's a vicious spiral. By his late 40s and early 50s, his waist has ballooned to over 50 inches. Contemporary sources describe mechanical devices, essentially early hoists, used to lift the king on and off his horse or move him between rooms. The confident athlete of his youth is gone. In his place is a man trapped inside his own bulk, and the body isn't the only thing changing. From the mid-1530s onward, people at court notice a different Henry, more paranoid, more explosive, quicker to see betrayal. Is that just the pressure of politics and the nightmare of trying to produce a male heir? Maybe. But modern doctors looking back at his case see something else, the aftermath of that head injury in 1536. A severe concussion can absolutely alter personality, causing mood swings, impulsivity, and depression years after the accident. So you've got a man in chronic pain, probably dealing with the long-term effects of traumatic brain injury, frustrated by his own body, humiliated by the daily rituals of treatment, and surrounded by courtiers who will smile to his face, while plotting behind his back. It's not hard to see how Henry the Magnificent evolves into the tyrant who sends wives, friends, and advisors to the block. But let's stay focused on the physical. By the 1540s, Henry is what modern medicine would call morbidly obese, likely with a BMI over 50. One endocrinology paper bluntly categorizes him as super-obese, with severe immobility and symptoms of heart failure. His leg ulcers are chronic and probably venous, linked to circulation issues in his lower limbs. There's evidence they sometimes penetrate deep enough to threaten the bone. Ambassadors mention that when the wounds flare up, the smell in his presence can be overwhelming. In a world before antibiotics, each infection carries the risk of sepsis. Add to that likely gout, possible type 2 diabetes, and soaring blood pressure from a diet rich in red meat, sugar, and wine. You start to see why some historians describe Henry's last decade as a long, slow medical crash. Then there are the more exotic theories. Over the years, doctors and historians have thrown around a whole menu of possible diagnoses: syphilis, Cushing syndrome, hypothyroidism, and more recently MC-Leod syndrome, combined with a rare Kel-positive blood type that could explain both his reproductive issues and some neurological symptoms. The sexy theory that Henry was eaten alive by syphilis refuses to die, probably because it fits the stereotype of the oversexed king. But the evidence is thin. There's no record of him receiving mercury, the standard and brutal syphilis treatment of the day. His pattern of symptoms doesn't match late-stage syphilis very well. Modern medical reviews tend to dismiss it. The more boring, and therefore more likely, explanation is a combo platter: obesity, cardiovascular disease, chronic leg ulcers, maybe some endocrine or genetic issues underlying it all. Whatever the exact cocktail, the effect is the same. By his 50s, Henry VIII is decaying from the inside out. So what does daily life look like for a king who is essentially rotting alive? Picture the Privy Chamber at Whitehall in the mid-1540s. Curtains drawn to soften the winter light. The king in a huge padded chair, legs propped on a stool, bandages peeking from beneath embroidered slippers. Physicians and surgeons come and go, arguing quietly about whether to lance the ulcers again, whether to cauterize, whether to apply some new imported unguent. They don't fully understand circulation or bacteria. Germ theory is 3 centuries away. Their treatments are a mix of observation, tradition, and wishful thinking. They might drain pus, apply honey or vinegar, dress the wounds with wool soaked in herbal mixtures. Sometimes they help, sometimes they make things worse. Every so often the king explodes, at a doctor who presses too hard, at a courtier who hesitates, at a servant who reacts to the smell. Then he calms, begs forgiveness, and demands music to distract him from the pain. And while all this is happening, the machinery of state has to keep moving. Henry still has to choose ministers, sign death warrants, negotiate with foreign powers, and play the dangerous marriage game with his children's futures. Even when he can barely walk, he's still the centre of gravity in English politics. By late 1546, though, everyone can see the end coming. The king's mobility is drastically reduced. He struggles with shortness of breath, likely from heart failure and maybe lung issues. He suffers bouts of fever, possibly from recurring infections in his legs or kidneys. He's in and out of bed, his mood swinging between lucidity and dark rages. Behind the scenes, factions at court battle over who will control the regency for his young son, Edward. Catherine Parr walks a tightrope as the 6th wife, caring for a sick, irritable husband while trying not to end up like wives 2 and 5. And then, in January 1547, the inevitable happens. On the night of January 27th, Henry is in bad shape. He's at Whitehall Palace, swollen and weak. Church law says no one can tell the king he's dying, but everyone knows. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer is summoned, but before he arrives, Henry slips into what looks like a coma. When Cranmer finally gets to the bedside in the early hours of the 28th, he leans close and asks the question that will decide everything. Does the king die in the faith? Henry can no longer speak. According to one account, he squeezes Cranmer's hand as hard as he can, a last ambiguous signal of belief. Shortly after, probably around 2 a.m., Henry VIII is dead at age 55. Modern historians think the immediate cause was likely heart failure, possibly complicated by kidney disease and the stress of long-standing infections. The enormous, ulcerated, rotting legs didn't kill him outright, but they sure didn't help. You'd think that would be the end of the story. But Henry being Henry, his corpse has its own afterlife. Here's where you won't believe what happens next, at least according to legend. On the way to his burial in Windsor, the coffin spends a night at Sion Abbey, a former religious house that Henry himself had dissolved during the Reformation. A century later, A Protestant historian named Gilbert Burnet records a story. During the night, the heavy, lead-lined coffin springs a leak. Horrible-smelling fluid seeps onto the floor. In the morning, witnesses supposedly see a dog licking up the king's blood, fulfilling an old curse that dogs would lap Henry's blood, like that of the wicked King Ahab in the Bible. In another version, the pressure of gases from decomposition actually causes the corpse to burst in the coffin, sending putrefied matter onto the floor. That's the version that makes its way into popular imagination, the monstrous king whose body literally explodes after death. So, did it happen? Probably not the Hollywood version. Bodies do produce gases during decomposition, and a poorly constructed coffin can warp or leak, especially with a very heavy corpse and winter temperature changes. Fluid leakage is absolutely possible, but the dramatic explosion is almost certainly a later exaggeration. Burnet is writing long after the event, and has a reputation for playing loose with details to make a moral point. Modern historians treat the story as colourful folklore, not hard fact. What is true is that Henry's body was big, hard to move, and not embalmed to anything like modern standards. It would have decomposed faster than a leaner corpse, especially if internal infections were already present at death. In that sense, the rotting king image isn't completely wrong. It's just that the rot was slow, painful, and mostly during his last years alive, not a dramatic after-death explosion. Today, if Henry VIII rolled into a modern hospital, the story might be very different. Surgeons could treat his ulcers with proper vascular techniques. Cardiologists would hammer his blood pressure and cholesterol. Endocrinologists could investigate underlying disorders like diabetes or Emax-Ciliaud syndrome. Physical therapists would fight to keep him moving. Bariatric specialists might even tackle the obesity directly. Would he be easy to treat? Absolutely not. Imagine a patient who believes himself appointed by God, hates being told no, and can have you executed for bad bedside manner. But his odds of dying at 55, essentially falling apart under the weight of his own body, would be dramatically lower. Instead, we're left with a historical irony that's almost too perfect. Henry spends decades remaking England around his desires, breaking from Rome, dissolving monasteries, killing opponents, reshuffling wives, all to secure a healthy male heir and prove his own vitality. In the end, it's his own health that fails him. The man who treated his kingdom like a body to be cut, cauterized, and rearranged dies in a body he can no longer command. Contemporaries saw moral symbolism in that. To them, the ulcers and the stench were visible signs of God's judgment on a sinful king. To us, they're a reminder that no amount of power, wealth, or spin can insulate you from biology. You can be the most feared king in Europe and still end your days immobilized by infected legs and heart failure. The real horror of Henry VIII's rotting isn't just the gore, it's the slow erosion of a person who once had everything. The athlete becomes the invalid, the charismatic prince becomes the suspicious tyrant, the body that conquered jousting lists and marriage beds becomes a prison that smells of decay. And maybe that's why the image sticks so hard in our imagination. It's not just about one Tudor king, it's about the universal, uncomfortable truth that time, injury, and our own choices eventually come for all of us, kings included. If this dive into the grisly final chapter of Henry VIII's life gave you a new way to see the man behind the legend, hit that like button, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories where the shine of power peels back to show the very human body underneath.